Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. As always, I'm your host Simon. Today we're covering Edgar Cayce, the freaky future visions of the sleeping prophet. No such thing as prophets, no such thing as future visions. It's been written by Danny. We're going to decode it together, so let's jump in. The format of the show, if you're new here, I've never read this before. That's what we do. Danny writes it, I read it.
Let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go.
If you're ever worried that you might be developing some sort of health problem, a sensible plan would be to go and get yourself checked out by a medical professional. Yes, it's kind of like the only plan, right? It's like, oh, I'm not feeling very well. Let's see if it goes away. And if it doesn't go away, off you go to the doctor. That logic obviously doesn't apply if you're a man, in which case you'll most likely do nothing at all and hope that the illness just magically cures itself. I mean, I think that's the right thing to do for most things, right? You're like, oh, I'm just feeling a little bit sniffly. Don't go to the doctor, you've just got a cold. And if you've still got a cold like a month later, maybe go get it checked out. Incidentally, that's really not a very clever long-term strategy, particularly if, for example, you're carrying a swollen appendix, which is very much on the verge of bursting. Oh, yes. And then you have that thing where you're like, oh, my appendix is swollen, it's so big, it's so painful. It's like, oh my God, it just suddenly got so much better. Oh, at least I don't have to go to the hospital now. It's like, no, you got to go to the hospital even quick because that burst and there's all sorts of nasty stuff now floating around inside your body. It's a danger zone.
1/2 teaspoon for fast, effective relief.
Just before we continue with today's video, let me thank one of my favorite sponsors, possibly my favorite sponsor, but I won't play favorites, except they are my favorite. I love you, Vessi. Vessi make these fantastic shoes. These are the Stormburst High Top. Winter's just around the corner. I haven't actually worn this pair. I had a white pair of these, which I wore pretty much all last winter. And the amazing thing about Vessi shoes is you think like white shoes in winter, isn't that going to be a bit of a nightmare? Like, I don't know, my garden's pretty muddy. I walk out to my car every morning. It's like, oh no, my nice white shoes. But because Vessi's made of something called Dymatex, it's 100% waterproof. You just wash them off and it's like, next ad read, I'll bring in my well-worn white Stormburst high tops. And you guys can have a look at how nice they are despite being constantly worn for an entire... Is it it might be 2 winters. But these are the kind of grey-black Stormbursts. I love these as well. I think I'm just going to wear these winter. I might just even rotate. And then you guys will just have to put up with me showing you fairly well-used Vessi shoes. They've also got this overcast jacket, which is fantastic. Look, Vessis are... you've heard me talk about them before. I just don't have enough good things to say about them. It's all I wear. It's waterproof. It's comfortable. It's breathable. It's fantastic. Also got this great grip, so you're not going to be slipping over. One time, little bit of a side story. This was before I was even doing YouTube. I was just walking along. It was like the depths of winter. It's like -10 outside, and I'm wearing like some boots, and I think the soles are a bit too worn down. And I'm just waiting at a traffic light, just with a group of people, and I just somehow just standing still slip, and it's literally like. Bang! And I just, my feet go up, my back goes down. I'm like, oh, my back! But because I was a young man, I just get right back up again, just brush myself off. My coat's covered in ice, and I'm like, everything's fine, nothing happened. And meanwhile, I'm like, oh, it hurts so much. But that would never happen if I had Vessi. However long ago that was. It's got to be like 10, 15 years ago now. But I still remember it. It was brutal. Look, enough. What you need to do is you need to go to Vessi.com and you can enjoy 40% off select waterproof styles with Vessi's Black Friday sale. Stay dry, save big, shop now before that deal slips away. Sorry, the Stormburst high tops and the overcast jacket. Almost got those the wrong way around. It's Vessi. It's Vessi.com. It's the best place to go. And let's get back to today's episode. Fortunately, 47-year-old Horace Bristle from Virginia was not suffering from anything as life-endangering as appendicitis when he started to feel a bit under the weather in 1928. Yeah, I mean, it's 1928. I'd rather have appendicitis today than whatever the disease he had in 1928. And it sounds as if he had his head screwed on tightly as he quickly decided to make an appointment at the local hospital to get to the bottom of his health problem. Whilst it sounds like Horace had the right idea, the plan starts to fall apart when you dig a bit deeper into his choice of hospital located in Virginia Beach. For starters, it was named the Edgar Cayce Hospital for Research and Enlightenment. If there is enlightenment in the title of your hospital, it's probably not a real hospital. It's probably people with like weird potions and they're thinking that water has memory and all that kind of nonsense.
Fine. If I heal you, can we divide the potions?
And this should trigger a few alarm bells before you've even swung open the entrance door. You're damn right. And whilst there were a few medical professionals bobbing around the corridors, the man who got his name on the sign had no medical background or training whatsoever. Well, that's normally fine. Like, there's loads of hospitals and universities and that are named after people who had nothing to do with them, or like just gave them a load of money. Because that's, that's how ego works. You want a wing of a hospital named after you? You don't have to be a doctor, you just gotta be rich. Edgar Cayce was a former Sunday school teacher and insurance salesman who later moved into the photography business, but he was not a doctor. In fact, he had received only the bare minimum of education, quitting school after 9th grade, as did many working-class children who were expected to stop pissing about at the earliest opportunity and go out and earn some money. I'm so glad that basically in the modern day you can piss around in education until your mid-20s. I was like, yeah, that's just acceptable. It's like back in the day they'd be like, oh, you've got fingers, let's get those fingers sewing buttons onto jackets or something. You're like, oh God. I'm so glad we live in the future. But baby Edgar should have been allowed to stay on longer, as it's widely reported that he could barely even read or write by the time he started looking for employment. I mean, it was like the 1920s. I'm sure literacy earlier than the 1920s. He was an adult going to hospital. Wait, no, this is Horace. Sorry. Whoever this Cayce guy... literacy back in the day, whenever this Cayce dude was growing up, probably wasn't brilliant, was it? Another disconcerting point for any patient attending a session with Edgar Cayce is that he had a tendency to sleep on the job. To be fair, that was the whole point. Edgar's rather unorthodox diagnosis methods involved putting himself into a trance during which he would be able to take a reading of the patient's body and come up with the best prescription for a speedy recovery. I hope that prescription was cocaine.
I'm on drugs!
It might sound a bit fishy to the more skeptical soul, but apparently it worked. Over the years, he performed thousands and thousands of such readings and was said to have cured an incredibly long list of patients who had been failed by more traditional medical techniques involving, say, physical examinations carried out by qualified professionals. It gets better, though. Edgar Cayce could do more than just heal the sick when he drifted off into one of his dreams. Although he usually tried to retain his focus on the purity of medical readings, he was often persuaded into performing other kinds of readings, some of which involved looking into the future and making eerily accurate predictions about the 1929 stock market crash, the Second World War, the deaths of 2 serving presidents, and much more besides. All of this sounds impressive. Today's script is 40 pages. We're on page 1. It's like, this is just going to get torn apart at some point where it's like, no, he didn't make any predictions. Because you can't see the future. It's not real. Like, Nostradamus is a much more famous prognosticator of the future. And I'm pretty sure we covered him. And it turns out he's basically all bullshit. And by basically all bullshit, I mean it is all bullshit. When in his trance state, he was also in a position to convey knowledge that hadn't yet been discovered by mankind. And the really cool thing is that the devout Christian never charged anybody for accessing his superpowers. Patients like Horace Thistle were permanently cured without having to pay a cent. Sounds like Horace might have made the right call after all. Edgar Cayce himself appeared to believe that he was tuning into the Akashic records, a kind of ethereal compendium of all past and future events which exist in an entirely different realm to our own. Is this something that is actually around, or did he just make this up completely? I mean, obviously it's not real, but is this something he made up in his mind? Or is this something that he's that actually was a thing before? But we have to ask ourselves what was really going on with the man who many consider to be the unwitting founder of the New Age movement, the whole New Age movement, huh? A man who had been known by many names, including the Sleeping Prophet, the father of holistic medicine, and the Miracle Man of Virginia Beach. How did a man with little education manage to cure so many patients and accurately predict future events even without bothering to open his eyes? Was he a genuine prophet, a gifted reader of the hidden catalog pages of the universe, a cunning businessman, a ruthless charlatan, or a confused delusionist? Ruthless charlatan doesn't seem to be the case because he's not charging people any money. I don't think he's a cunning businessman, again, because of the money thing. He's obviously not got access to the hidden pages of the universe because that's not a real thing. So I'm going with the confused delusionist. To be honest, I think he's probably just a bit confused and a bit mad. Could the truth be far more complicated than any of that, or was it something we could all have figured out in our sleep? I'm not sure I've had many jobs in my life where I've got away with falling asleep at work. I once wanted to they do these things called sleep studies, where you go somewhere and they attach all these cables and brainwave readers to your brain, and then they make you sleep in the hospital overnight, and they measure your brain for science research or whatever. And I tried to get on one of these once, and I didn't. I can't remember why I got rejected. There was some reason. Anyway, and yeah, you just got paid to go into the hospital and sleep with all this equipment on your brain. Oh, that sounds pretty good. Sounds like a good way to make some money. My friend's dad got sacked for falling asleep on the job, but he was a bus driver. That's not a gag, it's absolutely true. Holy shit, dude. You don't want your bus driver falling asleep. God damn. When the topic is regularly brought up around the pub table, my defensive mate is always keen to emphasize that his dad wasn't actually driving when he fell asleep. He was parked next to a bus stop. Well, that's fair, but he did have a bus packed full of angry passengers who had been hoping to get to work that morning and were unable to wake the driver despite prodding him with sticks at one point. Holy shit. How tired was this guy's dad? On a rather annoying note, I find that I often work in my sleep today. I'll spend the whole night dreaming that I'm wrestling with the next few paragraphs of my current script, and even though I eventually get it cracked, all the hard work is lost forever when I wake up the next morning. I have to start all over again using real words from real languages, which makes the job 10 times harder. Yeah, Danny, I'll be really disappointed. Danny turns in a script, it's halfway done, and then it just turns into complete gobbledygook that Danny just slapped out on his keyboard while he was asleep. However, in the curious story of Edgar Cayce, watching him fall asleep on the job was all part of the package. It usually went down like this. Assuming that you were attending an in-person session with the man himself, which wasn't always the case, you would be greeted by Edgar Cayce, who would take off his coat and tie, loosen his collar, belt and cuffs, and then proceed to get comfortable on 2 tables, which had been shoved together to form a makeshift couch. 2 tables? You're just having a sleep on the table? That does not sound comfortable at all. As he reclines on the tables, he would emit a deep sigh before seemingly falling into a light sleep. I fell asleep at work yesterday. Speaking of sleeping at work, I was recording a video and my eyes were closing. I'd had a really rough night's sleep and I'd woken up early and gone to bed late. And I was just like, oh, okay, whatever. I just stop the video recording. I take a 20-minute nap on the sofa and then I come back and I feel so much better. I think your mate's dad was right to take a nap at the bus, because it's better to have the nap as the bus driver at the bus stop when the bus is stationary than to fall asleep while you're driving the bus 20 minutes later. I think his dad was onto something. As one witness explained, his gaze grew dreamy and a light crept into his eyes that betokened the coming trance. Brand new word for me right there, betokened. Oh my, oh no, it is in the dictionary, betoken. Be a warning or indication of a future event. There you go. I mean, I could have got that from the context. I just wanted to look it up to make sure. It's a brand new word that I've never heard before. With his eyes now fixated on the ceiling, Edgar would begin to slowly perform his reading of the patient. If you were having a medical reading, you'd know that things were moving in the right direction when Edgar quite creepily intoned the words, "We have the body," before moving on to a full diagnosis of any health problems. Oh my. A typical example plucked from 1935 shows that these readings were hardly short and snappy affairs, and Edgar did have a tendency to waffle a bit. It begins, "Yes, we have the body here, the entity we have had before. Now, as we find, there are very definite conditions that disturb the metaphysical functioning of the body, and these, as we find, have to do with accumulations that have occurred in the body through an unbalancing of the elements that are necessary for the reaction of the organs related to the activity of the secretions necessary for activities in the system." Oh my god, dude. It sounds like you're getting paid by the word. Edgar drones on in this manner for quite some time before eventually diagnosing the health issues in excruciatingly long-winded detail and then recommending the appropriate remedies and life changes. There was usually time for a final brief question and answer session before the patient and the still sleeping Edgar, but you knew that the session was over when he wrapped up with the words, "We are through with this reading." One slightly odd point is that when Edgar emerged from his trance, he would have no memory of anything that he'd just said. It's reported that he didn't even have complete understanding of his own words. Dude, no one had understanding of your own words, because you're just like, and then the secretions of the activities in the organ with the activities secretions in the organ. It's like, what are you talking about? You're just naming body parts and things they do. It is reported that he didn't have complete understanding of his own words when they were read back to him by his secretary, who had been scribbling them down during every session. And he became troubled by some of the points he had made during his more philosophical readings, which conflicted with his own religious beliefs. Under normal circumstances, this might have posed a problem in a typical doctor's surgery. "So, Mrs. Broomstick, I'm prescribing you a 28-day course of ketamine. That'll soon have you back to your old cheery self." "Thank you, doctor. How much ketamine should I take a day?" "Ketamine? Why would you take that? Who are you anyway? What are you doing in my treehouse?" The doctor needs a doctor. Of course, Edgar wasn't in a position to prescribe proper medication, and his readings were legally considered as personal recommendations rather than professional advice. It was the 1930s. Did you need prescriptions? You just go to the pharmacy and be like, yeah, I'll take some K, some Charlie, and some smack, please. Thank you very much. This wasn't usually a problem anyway, as he tended to recommend herbal remedies and stuff that was available without prescription, but he did have a small team of real medics working at the hospital, and they would occasionally provide a patient with a legal prescription based solely on the word of a former insurance salesman who had just fallen asleep on top of 2 tables. Although he first began performing his readings in 1902, it wasn't until 1923 that they were properly recorded and preserved for the first time. A total of 14,306 readings from 1923 onward are still held by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, a non-profit society which was founded by Edgar himself and is still very much active today. Whatever you want to say, if you've started something 100 years ago and it's still active today, that's pretty impressive. And transcripts of all those readings are available online to every member of the society, or you can even flick through physical copies if you ever happen to be passing through the library section of the society's visitor center in Virginia Beach. Due to the verbose and often mind-numbing nature of the readings, I suspect that less than a handful of people on the planet have actually managed to make it through all of them. Yeah, why would you? Just reading the same thing over and over again. The secretions from the organs which are secreting organs.
What's wrong with me?
Trying to absorb the whole collection would be even more of a challenge than getting through a version of 50 Shades of Grey which had been reworked and vastly expanded by J.R.R. Tolkien. Fully agree. Over 9,000 of the existing transcripts relate to medical or health readings that Edgar strongly favoured. Just under 2,000 were known as life readings, in which Edgar would describe past lives of the apparently reincarnated client. Just gotta throw some reincarnation in there. What are we gonna get? Aliens? Come on now. Often claiming that the client used to be a member of a royal family or a powerful leader or a celebrity TV gardener. No, you never reincarnate. It's like, oh no, you were just, you were a bus driver. That's what you were. It's always something more interesting. Other types of readings focused on dream interpretations, auras, mental and spiritual development, and the kind of stuff that immediately evokes the potent scent of joss sticks. But perhaps the most intriguing types of reading were the ones in which he was invited to look into the future, either on a grand scale with regard to massive global events, or on a smaller scale, in which he was sometimes cheekily asked about the location of buried treasure or the state of next week's stock market. Edgar didn't actually like doing the latter type of financial reading at all, as it clearly didn't sit right with him, and he often complained afterward of a terrible pain in his head. More like he doesn't want to do it because it's in the near future and it'll very quickly be proven wrong. He eventually banned clients from asking questions relating to potential financial gain, but a few of them still tried it on him whilst he was under his own deep hypnotic spell. Should I eat more fruits and vegetables, Mr. Cayce? Do I need to go for longer walks every day? Do I need to take more vitamin supplements? Oh, and given the current volatility in the broader market characterized by the recent uptick in geopolitical uncertainties and shifts in fiscal policy, when would be the best time to shift my share in General Motors, Mr. Cayce? Edgar was never in a position to argue when he was in his trance, and he always rattled off all the information and hot tips requested by the clients. But he always knew afterward that he'd been taken for a fool when the headaches kicked in and he felt drained of all energy, which Edgar took as signs from God that he should only use his special powers for body and spiritual healing rather than greedy material gain. He eventually roped in his own wife, Gertrude, to sit in on all of the sessions and guide the conversation, and she would now be the only person allowed to talk directly to Edgar while he was in a trance. Not that every client was required to turn up for a personal session anyway. In later years, Edgar was happy to tune into the entity of the client simply by reading a letter that they'd sent him with a few personal details and a specific request as to what they were after. It's amazing that he's not charging for this. This seems like such a con. Like, he's just pretending to be he's a medium or whatever. He's just a fancy pretending to be scientific medium. And he's not charging for it, though. So he's got to be delusional, right? This does make me wonder why he went to all the trouble of opening a hospital, which was inevitably hit by financial strife, not least because Edgar wasn't actually charging anyone for his services. He may as well have stayed at home and worked remotely. He still wouldn't have earned any money, but at least he wouldn't have had so many overheads to cover. It's widely reported that those 14,306 readings were the sum total of Edgar Cayce's work, but that's not taking into account any of the mostly medical readings he had undertaken during the previous 20 years, which had not been preserved. Exactly how many readings he performed during his lifetime is unknown, but the figure is likely to run into the tens of thousands, and the long list unofficially features a few high-profile names who sought strictly private life and spiritual readings, including the likes of Thomas Edison, Harry Houdini, Woodrow Wilson, George Gershwin, and Marilyn Monroe. Thomas Edison... No, I'm thinking of... Why am I confusing Thomas Edison and the British author who believed in ghosts? Because Harry Houdini... God damn it, who wrote Sherlock Holmes? Who wrote Sherlock Holmes? How can I not remember this? But that dude believed in ghosts. Charles Dickens. No. Simon, get your shit together. Harry Houdini was like a major skeptic. So I imagine he must have gone to this to see what was going on, rather than actually because he thought, there was any sort of future reading, or magic. The sheer volume of reading suggests that Edgar Cayce was very much in demand. Admittedly, the number may have been significantly lower if the readings weren't being given away for free. As Edgar was happy to provide readings for just about anyone who requested one, I can see why there was a big uptake from people with nothing to lose, and I also suspect that a lot of people returned for additional free readings. But even so, thousands upon thousands of people over the years put their faith in a man with basic education and no medical background at all. So, how did we get to this point? Well, it's a bizarre tale of frequent nasty accidents, ghost grandfathers, a voice that went missing, and a message from a woman with wings. All right. Oh dear, I've got a feeling that all of this is going to get a bit silly for the next few pages, but just wait until we get to the bit where he predicts the assassination of JFK. Okay, let's go. The War of the Words. What we do know for sure about the very early life of the Sleeping Prophet is that he was born at the age of 0 in Christian County, Kentucky, just like everybody else. I mean, age of 0, not everyone's born in Christian County, Kentucky, that'd be weird. He was one of 6 children born to Leslie and Carrie Cayce, who had struggled with the farming life for a while before conceding defeat and opening a small dry goods store. I'd much rather have a dry goods store than be a farmer. I've been watching that TV show with Jeremy Clarkson, Clarkson's Farm. Being a farmer looks really difficult and miserable, and you got to be outside all the time, and it's cold. Dry goods store is you just got to be inside, and there's some dry goods, and someone comes just like, I'll have some beans, and you'll be like, here's your beans. Boom! That's much more my speed. Actually, much more my speed is just making videos for the internet, because it's kind of like not like work, but you still get paid. It's kind of nice. Edgar was more than a little accident prone and has endured an endless chain of injuries during his childhood, which included getting a nail stuck in his head and a large stick lodged inside one of his testicles. Ugh. This kind of clumsy behavior may have run in the family, though, as his granddad suffered a rather more serious incident on a horse which tragically killed him, a grisly scene which was witnessed by a very young Edgar, although it probably wouldn't be the last time the pair would meet. He's going to meet his ghost grandfather, isn't he? He later claimed that he saw the ghost of his grandfather regularly wandering around outside the house in a shimmering transparent haze. No, he didn't, because his ghosts aren't real. Edgar developed an early obsession with the Bible from the age of around 10, reading it repeatedly from cover to cover throughout his childhood. Even in later life, he would continue to read the Bible in its entirety at least once a year. God damn, isn't the Bible like 300,000 words long or something insane? I feel like it's maybe even more than that. Suddenly, that reworked and expanded edition of 50 Shades of Grey by J.R.R. Tolkien doesn't seem quite so bad. But his childhood wasn't all about Jesus. He sounded like a popular kid at school who had a wide circle of good friends. I mean, admittedly, all of his friends were imaginary, but that's not always a bad thing, as they tend to be a bit less argumentative than real children. Besides, whilst his parents were concerned that their son appeared to be spending much of his time with make-believe playfolk, the boy himself seemed convinced that he was actually playing with spirits from another plane. Or more likely he's mentally ill. Edgar wasn't having such a great time with the academic side of school, though. While later reports of complete illiteracy seem somewhat at odds with his compulsion to reread the Bible over and over again, he did struggle with most subjects at school, and teachers often complained about the severe lack of concentration, an accusation which his imaginary friends appeared to avoid despite their similar lack of focus. His own father, Leslie, got annoyed with him during a surprise test at home, at which Edgar was performing spectacularly badly, that he struck him hard enough to knock him right out of his chair. Some quality parenting right there. According to Edgar, the young lad shuffled off to his bedroom in tears, still clutching the book on which he was being so ruthlessly tested. He briefly fell asleep on the book, at which point a brilliant light filled the room and an apparition of a woman with wings appeared at the foot of his bed. This angel, I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume it was an angel rather than a passing mutant woman, promised Edgar that they would help him and urged him to spend the rest of his life helping others, particularly the sick, the lost, and the afflicted. When a bedazzled Edgar emerged from his bedroom, it didn't take long for his dad to start hassling him with test questions again. God, I used to hate this as a kid. My dad would always be like, yeah, okay, so we'd be on a trip somewhere or a car trip or whatever. He'd be like, now's the perfect time to try some times tables. And I'll be like, oh no, why? I don't like it. Yeah, I hate it. It's like, can't I just learn this at school? I don't want to learn it in my free time. But this time, Edgar got every question right to the extent that it appeared he was parroting every line from the book that his dad was now holding. It appeared that the child had somehow memorized the entire book simply by sleeping on it. You'd have thought that his dad might have been impressed by this sudden turn of events, but no, Leslie just clouted his son around the lug hole on the grounds that Edgar must have been purposefully pissing about during the previous test. Oh, God. His dad might have been a bit more impressed in the long term, though. Edgar reckons that his grades dramatically improved over the next few years, and he soon rose to the lofty heights of school SWAT. What is a school SWAT? A triumph which he puts down entirely to his newfound ability of being able to memorize all of his study books simply by taking a quick nap on them. That's not real. That's not possible. He claims that when he lay his head on the cover of a book, he could see all of the pages in his mind, or where they could be stored and retrieved at will. It's a handy trick, but I'm not entirely sure how this worked in practice in the classroom. Sir, do you mind if I just go sleep on this book instead of reading it? No problem, Edgar. Shall I get somebody to fetch you a glass of warm milk? I don't think this happens. I don't think this is real, because it's not possible. The angel super still couldn't help clumsy Edgar keep out of the way of sharp testicle-bound sticks and other random flying objects, though. In 1892, when Edgar would have been 15 years old, he got stuck right in the coccyx by a baseball during a game at school. Oh my lord, that's going to be so painful. I'm wondering if his alleged lack of concentration was a major factor in all of these incidents, and his mind was constantly away with the fairies and his imaginary playfolk whenever anything came hurtling in his general direction. Yeah, people who are like away with the fairies, they're more likely to trip over stuff because they'll just be walking down the street thinking about fairies or whatever, and they'll be like, I just didn't even notice that lamppost. In this case, he was left in a state of agonizing pain and deep shock, and he began behaving even more strangely than usual. His parents were concerned that he might have suffered a serious long-term spinal injury. They watched over him that same night as he drifted restlessly in and out of sleep. But then, whilst he appeared to be enjoying a brief period of calm sleep, he suddenly began rattling through all the natural ingredients for a remedy that would instantly cure him. Figuring that they may as well give it a try, his mum went into the kitchen and prepared the remedy whilst his dad stayed at Edgar's bedside, most probably resisting his natural urge to batter his son around the head and shove him out of bed. Quality parenting! And would you believe it? And no, I don't either. This apparently worked a treat, and Edgar was almost immediately back to his old self and healed of any pain or ailments. He's like, go to the kitchen. We'll make a magical potion that was maybe better. First of all, take the morphine out of the cupboard. Secondly, give it to me. I'm healed, mother! However, he had no memory of her talking in his sleep, and he was mostly unfamiliar with any of the ingredients that went into the remedy. You'd think that all of this would have led directly into the next thrilling chapter of The Snoozing Pharmacist, but in fact, it all went oddly quiet after this for the best part of a decade. I would have expected a bit more attention and interest from parents and teachers in a boy who could memorize entire books without even reading them and prescribe himself remedies during a self-diagnosis performed whilst fast asleep. But no, apparently everyone just shrugged and forgot about it all for a while. However, we do have to remember that all of this stuff about ghosts, angels, and magic tricks came directly from Edgar Cayce himself later in life. Well, there we go. That explains it. It's like, why does all of this stuff seem like historical fact? Well, because it's coming from his mouth. He's the only person who verifies this in any way. So we may have to take what he says with a pinch of salt. Thankfully, the rest of his life is based on more than the word of a man who sees dead people. After the family moved to Kentucky, Edgar left school at the earliest possible opportunity and formed a partnership with his father, flogging Woodman of the World Insurance. Edgar was also still very much a Bible basher and now taught at Sunday school. He had first met the love of his life, Gertrude Evans, when he was 18 and she was just 15. They would go on to marry in 1903 and have 3 sons, Hugh Lynn, Milton Porter, and Edgar Evans, although sadly the middle child, Milton Porter, died in infancy. Ah, the 1900s. Early 1900s. I was born in the 1900s, but there was medicine and by the time I was born. By this time, Edgar had already suffered yet another affliction, which this time had nothing to do with baseballs or large sticks. He had developed severe laryngitis in 1900, which resulted in the total loss of speech for well over a year. This naturally proved to be a bit of a hindrance when he was trying to sell insurance. Oh my god, I hope I don't get laryngitis. Not being able to record videos for a year would be disastrous for my business. So his dad left it to go alone while Edgar took up an apprenticeship at a photography studio in Hopkinsville, where he was largely confined to the darkroom around the back and didn't need to talk to customers. It looked for a while as if he might be destined to spend the rest of his life lurking around darkened rooms in complete silence. But then help came from the unlikely form of a traveling hypnotist and entertainer who went by the name of Hart the Laugh Man. The fairy tale version of this story suggests that Edgar just happened to be in the audience whilst the Laugh Man was in town, and he was pulled out onto the stage to be put under hypnosis, after which his missing voice miraculously returned. It's a little more complicated than that. Edgar actually arranged for a private meeting with Hart, who offered to try and cure him for the sum of $200. Oh my god, that's an enormous amount of money today, which would only be payable if the hypnotist was successful. This was no small amount back then, worth close to $7,000. And I'm not sure where the photography apprentice would have sourced it from, but he agreed to the deal. It turned out that he didn't have to cough up the money, although the initial results had seemed quite promising. Whilst under hypnosis, Edgar's voice returned, but it disappeared again as soon as he woke up. And despite the Laugh Man's subsequent attempts to plant post-hypnotic suggestions inside Edgar's head, the voice stubbornly fell quiet as soon as Edgar emerged from the trance. The traveling hypnotist couldn't hang around for long and had other towns to visit, so he moved on in defeat without his $200 bonus. But Edgar had felt encouraged enough to pursue the case with other hypnotists and eventually hit upon the winning formula with local hypnotist Al Lane. After Lane had put his new client under hypnosis, is hypnosis real? I swear like I've looked into hypnosis and stuff, not because I'd ever consider having it done, just like out of curiosity. And it always just seems to be that, like hypnosis works for people who want to be hypnotized. Which basically means it's kind of a placebo? No? Anyway, Edgar suddenly became quite chatty and declared that he was suffering from partial paralysis of the vocal cords, which could be cured by an increase in blood circulation to the throat. According to Lane, his client then remained under hypnosis for around 20 minutes, during which time his chest and cheeks turned rosy red before he eventually declared that the treatment was over. Although there were to be a couple of brief relapses over the years, it appeared that Edgar Cayce had simultaneously diagnosed and cured his own condition, although he again had no memory of anything he had said or done. Al Lane was understandably pretty impressed by this, and he became convinced that Edgar possessed some kind of clairvoyant ability, which, under Lane's own guidance and supervision, should be offered as medical service to the public. Edgar was not mad keen on the idea. He was feeling confused as to where his abilities were coming from and was worried about the notion of offering advice on subjects that he knew nothing about in the first place and which he couldn't even remember afterwards. His wife Gertrude also felt uncomfortable and perhaps even a little frightened about the whole idea. She just wanted her family to enjoy a simple, ordinary Christian life without all this weird, mystical healing nonsense. And there were serious potential consequences for all parties to consider here. What if a client later died after receiving the wrong advice from a sleeping psychic? What happens if they burn him for being a witch?
We can burn the witch later.
However, Edgar was persuaded by Al Lane to carry out the medical readings at Lane's office, but only on the conditions that they would be entirely free and that the service would be stopped permanently if any of the clients, or essentially patients, were hurt. Well, they're not paying for it, right? So is there really a duty of care there? Like doctor to patient, sure, but he's just a random dude. I kind of think if you're taking the advice of the random dude who is not a doctor and he's doing it for free and he's lying on two tables pushed together, like, more fool you, my dude. It's not clear what Al Lane was getting out of putting on these entirely free readings, unless he figured that they might whip up more publicity for his own hypnotist business. But I doubt that, as it was a fairly low-key operation, possibly because Lane may have had some concerns over the legality of the enterprise. Lane himself was instrumental during these very early years, as he was the one who placed Edgar into the hypnotic state, only stepping back from proceedings after Edgar finally intoned those words, "We have the body." Later experiments concluded that the patient didn't necessarily have to be in the same room as Edgar. Even later experiments would conclude that the patient didn't have to be in the same building or the same country. No, he's doing it with letters. I mean, he wasn't, but he says he was. This entertaining local double act lasted for a couple of years, during which time many happy customers were said to have benefited from the advice of the non-medical somnambulist. I guess that's something about sleeping? Somnus? Okay. Learning all sorts of new words today, Danny. One of the patients was none other than Gertrude Cayce, who had become seriously ill with tuberculosis and had reportedly been told by doctors that she may not survive. Gertrude acted on the advice dispensed by her own snoozing husband, and while she still endured a long, tough battle on the road to recovery, she did eventually get better. Another quite remarkable case, which drew plenty of local media attention, was the reading that Edgar performed for a 6-year-old child by the name of Amy Dietrich. The papers have become particularly interested in this story, as Amy's father was a prominent school superintendent. Amy had become almost catatonic since an attack of influenza at the age of 2, which had made her intellectual functions begin to degenerate. She was now suffering from up to 20 seizures a day and was unable to recognize her own parents. She had been seen by 5 different doctors who all concluded that nothing further could be done. When Amy was taken to see Edgar Cayce and Al Lane in 1902 as a desperate last resort, Edgar appeared to be able to look back into the child's past from within his trance state. He revealed that shortly before she developed influenza, Amy had slipped and fallen from a carriage, hurting her spine, upon which the infection had later settled. Edgar recommended osteopathic manipulations of the spine. That's also not a real thing, right? That's like up there with chiropsy? Chiropactory? Chiropractors? As being like, it's not real medicine. And after just a week of this treatment, Amy showed dramatic signs of improvement and was able to recognize her parents. Within 3 months, she was back to perfect health and developing normal cognitive functions again. Amy's delighted parents were happy to publicly proclaim that Edgar Cayce was the man who had cured their young daughter after the qualified doctors had completely given up. However, despite what appeared to be a pretty good hit rate, the double act was destined to call time after just a couple of years. Following concern and complaints from real doctors who knew what they were doing, the state intervened and ordered Al Lane to stop the medical readings that he was supervising. Maybe it was finally time for Edgar to wake up and smell the dandelion root. I mean, yes, or maybe the real doctors are like, we're going to be out of business if the sleeping dude just fixes everyone. We got to run him out of town. That's what the conspiracy theory people would say, and I think it's nonsense. Sorry. The wheels of chance. Edgar Cayce seemed to drift away from the concept of psychic diagnosis over the next few years. He got a job in a bookshop for a while before opening up 2 photographic studios, both of which later burned down and forced him into bankruptcy. Oh no, if only he'd gone into one of his little naps and be like, oh, it will burn down, get a fire extinguisher. During this period, he'd also taken an unusual sidestep into developing a fast-paced commodity trading card game, which went by the name of Pit. That sounds kind of fun. This card game was snapped up at the time by Parker Brothers, and it's still available today across the globe, albeit under a variety of different names. I want to know what the names are, Danny. I want to buy the commodity trading card game. I like games. Sadly, it's alleged that Edgar failed to cash in on his own commodity. He had sent in the idea to Parker Brothers without copywriting it first, and the company is said to have simply sent him back a thank you letter and a few packs of the freshly produced card game in return. It's his copyright, whether he's copyrighted it or not. When you make something, it's copyrighted. Like, me making this episode, I don't have to go file copyright for it. It's my copyright. It's on creation. I think Parker Brothers allegedly screwed the shit out of him. When Pit began to take off in the shops, Edgar hired a lawyer to try and claim his rightful share of the game's success, but nothing could be done as Parker Brothers had already seized the copyright. This sounds like he needed a better lawyer, or maybe copyright law worked different in the past, or maybe I just don't understand copyright law. It's all entirely possible. Who would have thought that the manufacturers of Monopoly would have allegedly turned out to be such ruthless capitalists? And the whole story of how Parker Brothers acquired Monopoly, or the Landlord's game, is extra interesting. I can't remember where I made a video about this. Maybe on Today I Found Out, a YouTube channel that I do. Maybe. It's a really interesting story. Having said that, it's often claimed that Edgar himself had largely ripped off the whole idea from a similar card game called Gavitt Stock Exchange, released slightly earlier. Bearing in mind his recent run of bad fortune, it's perhaps not too surprising that an initially hesitant Edgar was eventually persuaded to get back into the sleeping psychic circuit in 1910. There was no longer a need for a hypnotist to accompany Edgar during these sessions, as he now developed the skill to place himself in and out of the trance state. The only other people in the room, aside from Edgar and the optional presence of the client who might just have decided to send in a letter, was the stenographer taking notes of the information that Edgar would instantly forget. And in later years, his wife Gertrude was there to guide the conversation. It's not entirely clear how Edgar was able to get away with providing medical readings after the previous operation was closed down by the state, but my assumption is that the first effort was billed as something close to a legitimate medical service, whereas Edgar was now distancing himself from that kind of idea. Although he disliked terms such as clairvoyant, medium, mystic healer, and nut job, he now preferred to think of himself as a psychic reader. And it's worth remembering that he was powerless to dispense prescription medication. A client would have to go and convince their own doctor to act on the recommendations made to them. Hello, Doc. I need a prescription for morphine because I went to this dude who took a nap on a table next to me and he said I needed morphine for my morphine stuff. Following this fresh run of conjuring up cures for deeply satisfied customers keen to spread the word, Edgar Cayce rose to national fame for the first time in 1910 following an article in the New York Times which ran under the killer headline, "Illiterate man becomes a doctor when hypnotized." It's a pretty fucking good title. That's a good-ass title for a YouTube video. This article was reprinted in several other newspapers across the US and featured an interview with the man himself who explained how he was harnessing the capabilities of the subconscious mind. I suspect he didn't approve of that headline, though. Whilst much has been made of Edgar's supposed illiteracy over the years, it sounds to me as if he may well have struggled with reading as a child, but he went on to become something of a ferocious reader in his adult life. Proper reading, too, not just falling asleep on the cover of a book and magically absorbing all of the contents after being blessed by an angel. I said he was going to say, like a proper book, not an audio book. It feels as if there was a general assumption from the media that Edgar must have been illiterate, as he didn't get any further than 9th grade. Still, the kid who never made it past 9th grade was still making a name for himself these days, even if he wasn't making any money from his gift. Whilst he had now turned his attention to full-time medical readings, he was still entirely reliant on voluntary donations. But things were set to take a more interesting turn much later in 1923 when a publisher from Dayton, Ohio by the name of Arthur Lammers came to Edgar with a new proposal. Lammers was a successful businessman who had a strong interest in metaphysics and theosophy, and he felt that Edgar should move on from medical readings and try experimenting with his psychic powers to unlock some of the hidden mysteries of our ancient roots and our place in the universe. After all, Edgar seemed capable of answering any question put to him when he tuned into his state of higher conscious, so why not ask him something really meaningful? Why are we here on Earth? What happens after death? What happened before the Big Bang? When is Jesus coming back? What will happen in the future? And what came first, the chicken or the dipping sauce? Come on, Danny, here's the chicken. Dipping sauce is a recent invention. Both Edgar and Gertrude were typically reluctant to pursue this new idea at first, but Edgar was eventually persuaded to give it a go when Lammers offered to put the whole family into a nice big house in Dayton with generous financial support. Okay, so he is getting paid. He's getting famous and he's getting paid. Maybe not directly from his clients, but he's making money, isn't he? Well, actually, that all went tits up very quickly as Lammers quickly found himself experiencing financial difficulties and withdrew his promised support, leaving the Cayce family in the lurch. Oh no! But this still proved to be the beginning of an intriguing new period for Edgar's psychic readings as he began waffling on at length about the evolution of man, the original simultaneous creation of 5 entirely different races on Earth, soul entities, star children, and reincarnation. All right. He spoke a lot about reincarnation, revealing how Jesus has lived in several different incarnations throughout history and how he himself used to be a high priest in Egypt back in the day. Of course he did. No one's ever a bus driver. But this kind of thing posed something of a dilemma for Edgar Cayce, as he would often feel horrified when the stenographer read back his readings to him. Much of it went against his own deeply held religious beliefs, which didn't generally consider stuff like reincarnation to be official canon. The awake version of Edgar would often disagree with the views expressed by the sleeping version of Edgar, as he mentally wrestled over fears that his work may be blasphemous, or that he was being possessed by evil spirits. At one point, he even angrily accused his stenographer of just making stuff up to annoy him. At least it made a change from all the strictly medical readings, and Edgar continued to expand his line of work following a family move to Virginia Beach in 1925, after they had been pretty much abandoned in Dayton by Arthur Lammers. Edgar was now performing readings relating to astrology, dream interpretation, spiritual healings, aura, the structure of reality, and all manner of other kooky shit. But amongst the most fascinating readings that he ever made were the ones in which he made bold prophecies that turned out to be chillingly accurate. Well, we'll see about that, Danny. The shape of things to come. Take, for example, the assassination of JFK. I told you we'd get there eventually. And in fact, when it came to making predictions regarding future presidents, Edgar turned out to be a triple hitter. He made the following statement during a 1939 reading. You are to have turmoil. You are to have strife between capital and labor. You are to have a division in your own land before you have the second of the presidents that will not live through his office, a mob rule. This is like some Nostradamus where it's like super vague and it's like, yeah, president at some point will die. Of course they will. It's a very dangerous job. Many of them have been killed. What he appeared to be predicting here, aside from all the turmoil and mob rule stuff, was the deaths of 2 serving presidents in the not too distant future. Wait, no, he says a second of the presidents that next will not live through his office. Well, doesn't he just mean that another president will be assassinated? Because presidents had already been assassinated at that point. Just 6 years later, in 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died from a cerebral hemorrhage shortly after he began his 4th term. Considering the unusually high number of terms that Roosevelt had been allowed to serve, perhaps he was always destined to die as a serving president at some point. Rather more unexpected and tragic was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, who fulfilled Edgar's prophecy of becoming the second of the presidents that will not live through his office. What about Lincoln? What about the other dude? Admittedly, it may have been a bit more impressive if Edgar had said something like the 35th president of the United States will get shot in the head and the back during a presidential motorcade in Dallas in 1963. But you can't expect the details to be quite so specific when you've got so much other stuff going on inside your head. Or maybe you can. At around the same time, he was also reported to have made a pretty specific prediction that the 44th president of America would be the first black president. This may be viewed as quite a brazen prediction to make in the 1930s, but he was proven to be bang on the money when Barack Obama was elected the 44th president of the US over 70 years later in 2009. Come on. That's pretty impressive. And he had much more up his divine nightgown sleeve. Well, yeah, but I want to know the quote, because it's going to be like, at some point, a man will, it's going to be very vague. He had much earlier predicted the Wall Street crash of 1929 several times. Yeah, but also I can tell you there's going to be an economic crash. It's called the business cycle. It happens. The first occasion happened quite by accident in a way, as Edgar had only meant to be providing a life reading for a young physician back in February 1925. Edgar was convinced that this young man of modest means would soon come into a lot of money, but Edgar urged the client to exercise caution. He observed from his trance, in the adverse forces that will come then in 1929, care should be taken lest this, without the more discretion in small things, be taken from the entity. A rough translation of this, in a less pretentious tongue, would suggest that the entity who worked as a physician in his current incarnation should take care of his newfound wealth and take it all out of the stock market well before 1929, when everything would go the way of the pair. Okay, this one's quite impressive. But then you got to say also, didn't he make like 15,000 predictions or something? It's a lot of predictions. Some are going to be right. Edgar gave further warnings to his clients about the 1929 Wall Street crash over the next few years, back in the days when he still gave such financial advice reluctantly. This was long before the headaches really kicked in, eventually prompting him to introduce his wife Gertrude into the sessions to ensure that any talk of material gain remained out of bounds. And he would later refuse to be swayed by any tempting offers to change his stance over this. Even though he was usually in a bit of a financial pickle himself, he consistently turned down lucrative offers of $100 a day to provide handy stock market forecasts. One of his final readings regarding the imminent stock market crash was given just 6 months before the event. Edgar warns a client, "We may expect a considerable break and bear market, see, the issue being between those of the reserves of nations and of individuals, and will cause a great disturbance in financial circles. This warning has been given, see." Funnily enough, most of his clients didn't see and decided not to act on the advice, so they were in just as much strife as everyone else when the Wall Street crash of late 1929 led swiftly to the Great Depression, the biggest and longest global economic downturn in history. You should have listened to Edgar. Sleeping Prophet supporters are also keen to point out that Edgar Cayce also predicted how just a single drop of blood may eventually be used as a diagnostic tool. This prediction was made in 1927 when such a concept would, according to the Medium website Today, have been considered the makings of science fiction. The theory goes that Edgar was referring to a form of biosampling known as the dried blood spot testing, in which a few drops of blood are taken from a heel or a finger and blotted onto filter paper for later analysis. Dried blood spot testing wouldn't be seen until 1963, when it was introduced by Dr. Robert Guthrie 36 years after the prediction. I mean, but again, it seems like quite an obvious one. It's like, okay, I think at some point in the future, we'll be able to analyze our breath to see if we have various diseases. Like, you'll just breathe into a machine, it'll be like, oh yeah, you got lung cancer. You've got this, you've got that. That will happen. That doesn't mean I'm like some sort of clairvoyant. It just means that you're like, oh yeah, technology is going to come. And if I make 10,000 predictions like that, lots of them are going to be right. I have to say that I'm not really buying this one though. For starters, the idea of using a drop of blood as a diagnostic tool had been floating around since the late 19th century, back when Edgar Cayce was still talking to women with wings. So it would hardly have been such an outlandish thought much later in 1927. And we also have to look at what exactly Edgar Cayce said. After a long and typically meandering monologue about bloodstream and reflections, he concluded his reading with the words, "The day may yet arrive when one may take a drop of blood and diagnose the condition of any physical body." Whilst we've made plenty of advances in diagnostic technology since then, we're still not at the stage yet where a single drop of blood can diagnose absolutely everything about the human body, despite what Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos may have told you. And now she's in prison. Perhaps Elizabeth Holmes was partly inspired to develop her ill-fated Theranos blood testing machine by the prophecies of Edgar Cayce. It might have been useful if Edgar had been still around during this period, as he may have been able to give her a life reading and predict a future in prison unless she calmed down a bit with her bullshit. But ultimately, whilst it's entirely feasible that this particular prediction may yet come true one day in the future, it hasn't come true yet. There were plenty of others on which he was proved right, though. For example, he predicted the beginning and the end of the Second World War. Back in 1935, 4 years before Hitler invaded Poland, Edgar gave a long reading which included the following prophecy. "This will make for the taking of sides, as it were, by various groups or countries or governments. This will be indicated by the Austrians, Germans, and later the Japanese joining in their influence and gradually growing to those affairs where there must be, as it were, almost a direct opposition to that which has been the theme of the Nazis, for these will gradually make for a growing of animosities. And unless there is interference from what may be called the many supernatural forces and influences that are active in the affairs of nations and peoples, the whole world, as it were, will be set on fire by militaristic groups." Again, there might be a minor problem with the specifics here, but the whole world getting set on fire by the actions sparked by an Axis alliance including Germany and Japan is one way of describing the Second World War, as it were. On a slightly more precise note, in 1939, Edgar would accurately predict the year in which the US would enter the war which had now kicked off in Europe. He provided the information to a retired American naval commander who was worried about getting called into active service again, a scenario which would indeed play out 2 years later as foretold by Edgar. He had a fairly brief answer when he asked in 1939 about what would happen to Hitler before the end of the war: death. And when he was asked in 1941 about how long the wartime conditions would last by a young man who was considering signing up with the Navy, Edgar's response was, until at least 1945. All right, very vague predictions. Again, as well as gazing into the future with often spooky accuracy, Edgar's abilities also allowed him to gaze into ancient history to reveal information which was not yet common knowledge. And there's not many people in the world who can claim to have later been proven right by the Dead Sea Scrolls, although sadly Edgar wouldn't quite live to see the discovery of the enlightening 15,000 scrolls and fragments unearthed in the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea between 1947 and 1956. The discovery of the scrolls, widely believed to have been either written or copied by a mystical Jewish sect known as the Essenes between 300 to 100 CE, was generally seen as a pretty big deal, as they contain the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible texts and dished up fresh insight into Jewish lives and practices and beliefs during the Second Temple period. Of particular interest here was the wealth of new information uncovered relating to the Essenes themselves, a sect which we'd previously known very little about, although we had put together some theories which turned out to be completely wrong. But I'm not sure what all the fuss was about, really. Edgar Cayce had already been banging on about the Essenes for years in his trances, and it appears that he knew exactly to what he was talking about, even though it contradicted contemporary scholarly opinion. We could probably have saved a lot of time and effort by just getting Edgar to recite the lost 15,000 scrolls in their entirety. We'd be here all day if we dismissed every specific slice of hitherto unknown information which Edgar had provided that was only later confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Edgar was indeed refreshingly specific when it came to the Essene. Some of the major elements include details of the disciplined rituals and communal lifestyle, of the sect, the important roles of women within a community previously believed to have been dominated by men, the messianic beliefs of a sect who were patiently awaiting the earthly arrival of no less than two different saviors, and the whole idea that a community living near the Dead Sea were the proud custodians of preserved texts and sacred writings, which would of course later turn out to be the very scrolls on which Edgar Cayce was being proven to be quite so spectacularly correct. Yep, that's the most impressive one so far. Not all of Edgar's insights and prophecies were about big league stuff. He occasionally took time to make little prophecies regarding his own life and give himself some helpful advice from his sleeping state. He's reported to have fairly accurately predicted the date of his own death, although we'll return to his death and indeed his reincarnation in just a moment. Okay then. Before that, the entity known as Edgar Cayce had only moved to Virginia Beach in 1923 after his stenographer relayed his own advice that he had given to himself while asleep. The idea was that Edgar's psychic powers would apparently grow even stronger when he was closer to the sea. That makes perfect sense. My psychic powers always go stronger when they're closer to the sea. Don't everyone's? Following the disastrous turn of events with Arnold Lammers in Daytona, perhaps it could be argued that moving anywhere else was a good idea, ideally to a house with a roof on top of it. But it really did sound as if the fortunes of the Cayce family did eventually begin to turn around after moving to Virginia Beach, during which time Edgar was finally able to open his psychic hospital known as the Edgar Cayce Hospital for Research and Enlightenment. And again, if you're ever going to a hospital and it's got enlightenment in the name of the hospital, maybe consider a different hospital. This one's going to be weird.
You're so enlightened.
He'd been trying to get a hospital off the ground for quite some time to focus more on the medical readings that he clearly preferred performing over all the other fortune-telling stuff which he was becoming increasingly famous. A common problem that Edgar was experiencing at this time was that not all professional doctors were willing to prescribe medication to their patients based on a reading made earlier by a sleeping prophet. If it's like not all professional doctors, it kind of sounds like the majority of professional doctors were willing. It's just a small minority who weren't, which is insane. Maybe that's another thing you should check. Hey, Doc, just before we have our first consult, have you ever prescribed anything on the recommendations of a prophet? And if the answer is yes, go somewhere else. He figured that if he could install his own small team of medical practitioners into his own private hospital, then his patients would stand a better chance of getting the treatment that they required. It sounds kind of like bribery. It's like, yeah, let's get some doctors in there. And they're going to take this job either because there won't be other jobs for them. Like, he just needs a prescription pad, doesn't he? Someone with a prescription pad and the power to issue a prescription. And he's like, yeah, we need some doctors who are a bit and could get work elsewhere. Or we need doctors who are just regular and we'll just pay them a fortune for them to just write these scripts. Naturally, raising the funds for such a venture was always going to be a bit of a problem, as Edgar was as determined as ever not to charge patients for his readings. One of his earlier ideas was to form the Cayce Petroleum Company, which would attempt to strike oil in Texas based on Edgar's own readings, a rare example of Edgar using his powers to raise some capital. This is my general thoughts, right? If he can predict things like where oil is, why isn't he the richest man in the world? Like, just use it a couple of times. Just be like, is Amazon going to do well in the year 2000? Yes, it is, Cayce. Get invested. Boom. Why does he possibly need money now? But sadly, this didn't seem to work out at all. A publicly embarrassing failure, which Edgar put down to the fact that not everyone involved in the operation was fully committed to the concept that any fortunes raised from the psychic oil prospecting should be used solely for the purpose of healing people in need. Or, tell you what, Cayce, you know what another explanation could be? You don't have magical powers, Cayce. But financial help eventually popped up during his time at Virginia Beach when he hooked up with the Jewish New York stockbroker Morton Blumenthal, who was able to raise the required funds from wealthy donors who had become entranced by Edgar's work. Blumenthal himself was plowing $8,000 a month into the hospital, which is an insane amount of money in today's money. He was a stockbroker. We don't know how rich he is, but he's going to be very, very, very rich to be able to afford that. And he also offered the Cayce family the use of a nice new pad by the beach, continuing the usual pattern of Edgar getting rich blokes to provide a home for his family. It's not bad, is it? The pretty lavish hospital opened on October the 11th, 1928, and for a while, it looked as if it was going to be a roaring success, as Edgar himself was becoming something of a celebrity figure by this point, and his psychic services were now very much in demand. He would also have been a pretty happy bunny, as for the first time in his life, he had a position where he could pursue his mission of providing free medical readings full-time without having to stress about how he was going to feed and support his family, which again pushes the idea this guy's not like a con man. He's a delusional man. I'm still a little puzzled as to the legality of an operation in which medical professionals were acting on the guidance of a former insurance salesman with no qualifications, but there was still plenty of grey areas in early 20th century American medicine, and I presume they never prescribed anything too dangerous. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there are grey areas in medicine today. You can go on the internet and, like, get drugs. Like, not illegal drugs. I mean, like, you know, you'll go to... Oh, we've had sponsors, and I don't have a problem with it, but it's definitely, like, not... I don't know. I feel... I don't want to throw shade on any of my sponsors, because I think it's fine, but is it how it was supposed to be? Whereas, like, you go to a website, you fill out a questionnaire, and, like, a doctor in a room at a company issues a prescription for you? I mean, I don't know. Besides, a medical prescription was a relatively rare event, as Edgar generally preferred to recommend herbal remedies, homeopathic treatments, salt packs, mud baths, massages, and if you were lucky, vibrator treatments. Okay, within a couple of years, Morton Blumenthal and Edgar Cayce were planning on building an accompanying psychic university slap bang next to the hospital, but then everything sadly appeared to turn sour between the pair. The fallout was largely down to Blumenthal's faltering finances during the Great Depression, when he was no longer able to throw money around in quite the same way as before. What do you expect? He's a stockbroker. There's going to be ups and downs, my dude. Like, you're not going to be able to... He's like, why are you stopping giving me money? It's like, bro, it's not my choice. I don't have that much money anymore, dude. Cayce, open your eyes, my dude. This was despite the fact that Blumenthal had earlier acted on Edgar's predictions about the imminent 1929 stock market crash, a move which had reportedly saved the stockbroker from losing somewhere in the region of $1 million. You'd think he might have been a bit grateful for that, but his gratitude could only go so far during the subsequent economic downturn. Yeah, okay, so he didn't lose money, but just because he didn't have all of his money in the market doesn't mean he lost money. He's just not making as much as before, which means he still doesn't have that much money to throw around. Your generosity can really only go so far, as Danny says. And it was clear that he couldn't keep plowing thousands of dollars into a project that didn't actually make any money. Although the hospital still boasted a waiting list that stretched out for months, he withdrew his financial backing and support, leading to the closure of the hospital in February 1931, just over 2 years after it had first opened. Blumenthal's probably like, bro, how about we start charging for people and stop doing it all for free? And Edgar Cayce's like, you're betraying my dream, Blumenthal. And yet again, the Cayce family were booted out of their home. In fact, 1931 turned out to be a pretty bad year for Edgar after he was arrested on charges of pretending to tell fortunes. That's a crime. Surely that's not a crime today. I mean, it's fraud. There's got to be some level where it gets to fraud, right? But for the most part, it's like, well, kind of more fool you for believing fortune tellers. Come on. This is America, the heart of capitalism. Caveat emptor, motherfuckers, along with Gertrude and his secretary, Gladys Davis. The charges against all three were ultimately dropped after the judge declined to interfere with the beliefs of an incorporated ecclesiastical body. But on a more positive note, this was also the year in which Edgar founded something which lasted for considerably longer than just a couple of years and would mark the beginning of the final phase of his life, during which he largely turned his focus away from medical stuff and moved into readings of a more spiritual nature. That sounds legally a little bit more safe, being like, yes, use this vibrator on your... I don't know what body parts, and that'll heal you of your demons that I've predicted. The Association for Research and Enlightenment was founded as a non-profit organization in 1931, partly to explore spiritual growth, personal development, and psychic topics via a network of study groups, and partly to preserve the continuing readings of Edgar Cayce. Although Blumenthal bailed out, Edgar was still able to attract financial backing from other supporters to get the new association off the ground, and the rest of his life was largely supported by membership fees raked in from the ever-growing association, which allowed him to buy his own family house for a change. That's nice bit of security there, because so far you've just been living in other people's houses. Smart move, Edgar. This does appear to reflect a subtle shift, or perhaps a not-so-subtle shift, his stance over charging for readings during his latter years. Well, I bet old Blumenthal was like, dude, I said like a decade ago. Why? Whilst it's still technically true to say that he never directly charged anyone for a reading in his life, from this point onwards he would usually only give readings to members of the association, which charged an annual fee. It's a nice way of basically saying, no, I don't charge, but you have to become a member, which is a chargeable thing. This also got around the risk of facing further charges of pretending to tell fortunes, as all paying members were required to sign a document which confirmed that they were simply taking part in psychic experiments. Clever. The Association for Research and Enlightenment continued to thrive long after the founder had departed his current body, reaching a peak of around 100,000 members during the 1980s, by which time Edgar's grandson was in charge of operations. Membership has dwindled somewhat since then, but it's still very much an active organization. However, the association no longer has any direct connection with the family, and critics of the current model argue that it's now simply a vehicle for promoting pseudoscience and draining the pockets of gullible fools bearing no relation to the original research and study project set up by Edgar Cayce. Got some news for those people. It's always been that way, except I guess with less draining of the pockets, because he didn't charge. He was delusional, not a con man. On an even more disturbing note, the last time that the association made the news was 2021, when a lawsuit was filed on behalf of 8 underage girls who alleged they were sexually assaulted by staff during a stay at the association's cult-like summer camp. Holy shit. I doubt that even Edgar could have seen that coming. It'd have been like, dudes, no. During Edgar's final years, he was more famous than he had ever been in his life, thanks largely to a popular article published in Coronet magazine, which ran under the headline Miracle Man of Virginia Beach, and a limited edition biography written by Thomas Segru entitled The Story of Edgar Cayce, There is a River. But with this increasing fame came increasing pressure, particularly during a period when bereft families were seeking answers about their loved ones fighting on the battlefronts of the Second World War, many of whom were now missing in action. Edgar's own health was deteriorating by this point, and he was finding that any kind of reading was now draining him of all energy. He had been warned by his sleeping self not to undertake more than 2 life readings a day to protect his own health, but he found it impossible to ignore the hundreds of letters that he was receiving every day that were begging him for help. Edgar often ignored his own advice. While he was recommending healthy diets and lifestyle changes to his patients, his own diet was far from healthy. He smoked like a chimney and rarely slept, at least not in the conventional sense. He's getting all of his energy from his naps, where he reads people's minds or fortunes or whatever the Towards the end of 1944, he collapsed from strain and suffered a stroke, after which he spent time recuperating in Roanoke. He returned to Virginia Beach at the very beginning of 1945, but he sadly did not live to see the end of the war that he had prophesied would not conclude before this year. Edgar Cayce died from complications following the stroke on January the 3rd, 1945, at the age of 67. And of course, it had been foretold. Well, kind of. Just a couple of days earlier, Edgar reportedly told his friends in quite a cheerful manner, "It's all arranged. I meant to be healed on Friday the 5th of January. Okay. Doesn't sound like he's predicting his own death there. He's predicting like, yeah, my stroke, my brain damage is going to magically heal itself. And all those cigarettes, all the tar in my lungs, gone. His friends apparently took this to mean his entity would be healed and reborn after his current body passed on. Oh, okay. So he's like, I'm going to be healed. And by healed, I mean die. And the date certainly proved to be quite significant, as this was the day on which Edgar Cayce was buried at Riverside Cemetery in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, near the place of his birth. He was joined just 3 months later by his devout, loyal, and probably often exasperated wife Gertrude after she died from cancer. But that is not necessarily the end of the story of the entity previously known as Edgar Cayce. Apparently not, because we're only on page 24 out of 40. So we're only a little over halfway through today's episode. Best-selling author of relatively recent pseudoscience, David Wilcock, allegedly. Pseudoscience is bull. Has made several subtle suggestions over the years that he might be the reincarnation of Edgar, without ever explicitly stating it. I'm the reincarnation of Edgar. You've got about as much proof as me, David. It could be argued that there's a certain physical resemblance between the two, and they certainly share the same interests in spiritual exploration and psychic topics. I don't, and I probably look nothing like him. But still, I'm his reincarnation, David. You prove you, I'll prove, It's absurd is what I'm saying. Wilcock once allegedly applied for a position at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, but his application was rejected following a lengthy interrogation by Edgar's son and grandson, who also demanded that he stop trying to imply in public that he was their spiritual relative. Edgar and David Wilcock are very clearly different souls anyway. Whilst Edgar was never particularly commercially minded, Wilcock seemed determined to chase fame and fortune by selling loads of crap books that spout utter nonsense, allegedly. It's such a grift, dude. These guys who are like, just making up some pseudoscience or like about ghosts and just writing a fiction book and labeling it as fact. It's such bullshit. I hate it. It's such a con. You're just taking money from stupid, gullible people. Besides, Edgar himself once recounted a dream that revealed that we wouldn't see him again until the 22nd century, when he would be reincarnated in Nebraska, which would be a coastal state by this time, following a dramatic shift of the Earth's poles. So that's alright then. But whether or not he's around in some shape or form today, Edgar Cayce's legacy lives on in the New Age movement, which first sprang up in the 1970s and was largely built on the foundations of Edgar's explorations into the spiritual, supernatural, alternative medicine, the higher state of consciousness, astrology, ancient mysteries, reincarnation, and presumably the concept of rarely taking a good bath. So thanks to Edgar for dragging us all into the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. Isn't there a song about that? It's the Age of Aquarius, something like that, no? Maybe? And he still boasts a huge army of zealous supporters today who truly believe that Edgar Cayce was a genuine example of a man with psychic abilities who could heal the sick and accurately predict the future. And I'm sure some of them would be in the comments. And guess what? You're wrong. And don't email me. Please don't email me. People email me after I say something like that. And they're like, well, actually, Simon, my mother went to Edgar Cayce's grandson in 1998 and he told her that she was going to have breast cancer and she got breast cancer. Oh my God. You must issue a public apology. You should delete your episode. Not happening. Not happening, you clown. I'm sorry about your mum. When the sleeper wakes, Edgar himself appeared to spend much of his life agonizing over his superpowers and pondering over where they came from, particularly as so many of his more philosophical readings conflicted with his deep-rooted Christian faith. I'm not sure why he felt there was such a mystery. There was obviously a connection here with his childhood visitation from the winged woman who appeared to gift him special powers with which he could heal the sick and afflicted and occasionally predict the results of next week's horse races. I mean, I can occasionally predict the results of next week's horse races. If I guess every week, eventually I'm going to get some of them right. But in later years, Edgar appears to have settled on the theory that whenever he entered a trance, he was actually tapping into the Akashic records, a kind of universal depository of all knowledge and all thoughts that have ever existed or will ever exist. All my thoughts. What am I thinking about now, Akashic records? What am I thinking about now? I'm thinking about Bluebell's Akashic records. I don't know how I even got there, but there's no way you could guess that. Bluebells. Those little flowers that you get in the forest. I have no idea where that came to. I tried to think of something truly random, and that's what came to mind. So it's kind of like an encyclopedia version of Spotify, except the Akashic records haven't just catalogued everything that has already been done, they've also catalogued all future events and experiences. The other main difference is that you can't just spend about $10 a month to get unlimited access. The Akashic records are only available to a tiny fraction of people on the planet who have figured out how to mentally tune into the ethereal data storage system, although Edgar occasionally suggested that anyone could be taught how to do this. This was not the whole story, though. Edgar also believed that he was able to tune into an individual's subconscious mind, which also contained hidden knowledge of past and future events not usually accessible during the conscious state. So he was able to derive all the required information from a combination of human subconsciousness cross-checked with an invisible universal library which doesn't have a traditional front door. I can't help feeling a little bit disturbed by the idea that nothing can ever be truly hidden or forever forgotten. I'm still racked with guilt over what I did to Archie Tadpole on that school trip to the National History Museum in London back in 1992, and it scares me to death that the details might be on display to psychics somewhere in the Akashic records. Oh no, Danny, worry! If you happen to have any psychic tendencies yourself, I implore you not to go looking. Tell you what, anyone who thinks they've got magical psychic tendencies, go looking. You're not going to find it's obviously nonsense. But maybe I shouldn't be overly worried. You shouldn't, Danny. Whilst the Akashic records sound like quite a cool place to hang out during a lunch break, the whole thing is little more than a theosophical concept. Whilst the word Akasha has ancient roots relating to the mysterious material found in our own earthly sky, sometimes known back then as the ether or the fifth element, the concept, that's where the name of that movie comes from. Who knew? The concept of the Akashic record is a relatively recent development from the 19th century when theosophists first began stirring a melting pot of ideas borrowed from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Western beliefs to create a supposed metaphysical catalogue of all creation that exists on an entirely different plane. I'm sure there are many who are quite drawn to the appealing idea that the universe has a secret, invisible hard drive backing up everything for future reference, as in reference in the future. And maybe there are a few gifted humans on Earth who have been given the password and the one-time 6-digit text message verification code. Oh my God, I was struggling with my bank this morning. They were like, yeah, we sent you a 6-digit code, SMS code, and I'm like, you haven't. And then you got to wait 60 seconds, and it's like, send another code. And I'm like, yes, please. Wait another 60 seconds. The code doesn't arrive. And they're like, come into a branch. And I'm like, no branches, please, for the love of God, no branches. And there's a branch close by. I just don't want to go. Why bang? But I'm a little dubious over how Edgar declared in later life that his powers came from a specific theosophical invention, although I suppose it could be argued that this was just his best guess and that he wasn't entirely convinced himself. We'll close the Akashic records for a while and take the time to consider how Edgar's psychic powers may not have been quite all they were cracked up to be. Oh, you reckon, do you, Danny? Interesting theory. Let's begin with all those amazing prophecies. He made a staggering pile of predictions in his time. Just like Nostradamus, if you predict everything, you're gonna get something right. And to support him, I put forward the theory that many of these may yet turn out to be true. If you're a patient soul who doesn't mind hanging around for a few more 100 years, you might get to see Edgar being proved completely right on such predictions as the invention of a self-fueling perpetual motion machine by a new fifth-foot race. It's a bold prediction right there. Or the discovery of a long-lost city of gold in the Gobi Desert in northern China, which will be found to contain elevators and electric cars. Again, very specific, and we've done, satellites taken a lot of pictures, and I feel like they'd find that, wouldn't they? Especially in the desert. Like, I know when you find new in the Amazon, but it's because there's like big trees everywhere, and now we've got that new technology to go looking for stuff. We find stuff. But in the Gobi Desert, it's a desert. There's not a lot of well, maybe under the sand, right? But look, I don't know why I'm trying to make a case for this. Electric cars, stop smoking crack. I think the trickiest readings to explain are the ones relating to the Essene sect. Not so much a series of predictions, but rather the divulging of information which flew in the face of conventional wisdom, and yet was ultimately proved to be correct by the latter discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Whichever way you dress this up, it was pretty impressive stuff, and it's almost enough to make you believe that Edgar had been given access to the Dead Sea Scrolls long before anybody else. I expect that the Akashic records held several copies. It's worth pointing out that the word Essene never actually appears in any of the scrolls, so it can't be conclusively confirmed that the Essenes were even the true authors, although this is now the widely accepted scholarly opinion. Still, widely accepted scholarly opinion can sometimes be proven completely wrong, as already illustrated by Edgar Cayce. But my feeling here is that whilst Edgar's musings over the Essene may have clashed with the more popular theories of the time, theories based on a sect who very little was known for sure about, that's not to say that other scholars may have also made alternative speculations long before Edgar's readings. It's not like Edgar was saying anything truly jaw-dropping here. He was making fairly general observations about rituals and beliefs and communal lifestyles, some of which were already speculated to be true of other Jewish sects in the Second Temple period. I'm sure that the former bookshop worker was an avid reader who spent a great deal of time studying alternative theories which challenge prevailing beliefs. He may well have been making educated guesses based on existing theories. Another point to bear in mind is that Edgar's long, rambling monologues about the Essene were often quite cloudy and obscure, and very probably weren't completely understood at the time. It was only after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that his supporters began to take another look at the readings and make fresh connections between the readings and the scrolls. Yeah, because when you have the information, you're like, oh look, I could shove this square peg in this round hole, boom, you make it fit, don't you? Because that's what humans do. We find patterns. It's like our superpower. It's possible that even if the scrolls had revealed entirely different information, some people would have then tried a way of interpreting Edgar's words to make them fit the discovery. Yes, exactly, Danny, thank you. Even so, I'm happy to admit that his readings on the Essene are quite remarkable, and I can see why they're often top of the list when his supporters attempt to wheel out evidence that their hero is actually a psychic. It's just not quite enough to convince me that this was the case with Cayce. I'd also conclude that Edgar did quite well to accurately predict when the US would enter the war 2 years before they did, although that again could be a fairly reasonable guess. Speaking of fairly reasonable guesses, predicting the death of Hitler before the end of the war he had just started would hardly have generated favourable odds down at the bookies. Whilst we're at it, the other predictions regarding blood testing and an imminent stock market crash could easily be regarded as perfectly reasonable, common-sense predictions, which any well-read person could have made. Yeah, I'm not a well-read person, but I know stock markets crash. It just happens. Edgar wasn't the only person in the world to have predicted an imminent stock market crash. Financial experts were also making declarations that the hugely buoyant state of the stock market was clearly not going to last forever and was due to take a massive tumble. One of the most famous predictions came from economist and business theorist Roger Babson, who warned the world in 1929, quote, "More people are borrowing and speculating today than ever in our history. Sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific." He means like terrific in the old school sense of the word. He's like, it could be terrific, like bad. I guess terrific is technically a neutral word. When it was inevitably proved right, the stock market decline was initially known as the Babson break, although that name didn't seem to stick. It's interesting that nobody was calling it the Cayce crunch, but in this instance it would appear that Edgar was most likely just getting his information from the Wall Street Journal rather than the Acacian records. A frequent problem with far too many of Edgar's predictions is the sheer frustrating fuzziness of them and the fact that he rarely spoke in clear and coherent sentences. Yeah, but that makes it more obscure and more vague, which makes it easier to get that square peg into the round hole. Boom. His readings regarding the beginning of the war, in which he speaks about the world being set on fire following growing animosity sparked by the Austrians, Germans, and Japanese, are noticeably light on specific detail and heavy on strange wording about supernatural forces and influences. Given that his readings were made just 17 years after the First World War, and given the subsequent rise of the Nazi Party, it perhaps wasn't so unfeasible anyway that another war would be on the horizon in which the Germans, Austrians, and Japanese might be fighting on the same side. As he didn't give any dates as to the start of the next war, his supporters would still have been claiming yet another psychic victory if it hadn't kicked off until 1987. And whilst his later prediction that the war would carry on until at least 1945 is a bit more specific, he would still have been technically correct if the war had carried on for another 10 or 20 years. Yeah, until at least 1945. That means it could be if the war had carried on to today, which would be insane and would definitely all be dead, but that would still be at least 1945 technically, because it's very vague. On a similar theme, the prophecies regarding the deaths of two serving presidents could be considered a combination of vague wording, a reasonable assumption, and incoherent babbling. It wasn't such an extraordinary thought that two or more US presidents may die while still in office. 6 serving presidents had already died in office, including 3 in Edgar's own lifetime. The readings were again light on detail, and no time frame was given other than that the second death would follow turmoil, strife, and mob rule. So Edgar appeared to be implying that 2 more presidents will die in office at some point, which is not exactly a compelling prediction in itself. No, 2 more presidents will definitely die in office. I'm not making threats, I'm just saying that over a long enough time frame, these things happen. I mean, Trump was almost killed twice. Oh, he's not. He wasn't a sitting president, I suppose. But yeah, it's a dangerous job, guys. I'm also a little puzzled as to what kind of turmoil, strife, and mob rule was being referred to, as it was supposed to happen before the assassination of JFK. Some have suggested that he may have been referring to the racial tensions of the 1960s. Well, you could just point to any turmoil, strife, and mob rule, and just be like, oh yeah, there was mob rule here, there was the strife. It's again very, very vague, purposefully, in my opinion. But again, the broad strokes of the reading could be interpreted to mean anything you want it to mean. I could predict right now that some heavy, gloomy shit is going to go down at some point in the next 20 years, but I don't expect to be hailed as a psychic genius when I'm inevitably proven right. However, I'm again mightily impressed by Edgar's surprisingly precise prediction that the 44th US president would be the first black president. You can hardly put that down to an educated guess over 70 years before the event. This has either got to be a staggeringly lucky gamble or his most triumphant prophecy of all time. Surely. Or maybe it's neither of those things. Yeah, if this is true, I mean, it's either a really lucky guess or there's something going on. I'm going to be like, it's just a really lucky guess, but it's more complicated, right? It's going to be like, oh yeah, he didn't actually end up predicting that. To begin with, in exactly the same supposed reading, he also claims that the 44th president will be the very last president and will be responsible for pulling the nuclear trigger. I have to admit, I don't think Barack Obama did that, unless my memory is failing me, but I don't remember him starting a nuclear war. I have to admit that this is a little disappointing. I initially figured that Edgar must be something of a progressive thinker to make a 1930s prediction of a black president, but now he seems to be suggesting that the first black president given the keys to the White House will blow up the world. After Barack Obama managed to get through his 2 full terms without triggering Armageddon, well done him. Some Edgar supporters, I'm now tempted to call them Edgar apologists, changed their tune and reckoned that it was all about how you count the presidents. As Grover Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms in the 19th century, this makes him officially both the 22nd and the 24th president, which would make Barack Obama the 43rd different president and Donald Trump the 44th president, who would push the nuclear button, which perhaps was a bit more likely if grumpy Trump had just lost another round of golf, which he was now claiming was rigged. That's a bit of a daft point to make, though, as it completely cocks up Edgar's numbering system of the first black president, which was the most impressive point. None of this really matters, though, as unlike all the other readings we've mentioned in this video, I can't find a credible source for this specific prediction about the 44th president. There you go, it just got made up by someone probably. This supposed prophecy often rides high in online studies of Edgar's greatest triumphs, but it's nowhere to be found in any of the 14,306 readings stored in the library section of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and there is no confirmed evidence that he ever made such a claim. Sadly, it seems like there was very good reason for it sounding a bit too clever to be true. I thought it was a bit weird that Edgar had been quite so explicit. He often avoided giving definitive dates and declarations in his readings, preferring instead to leave things a bit more open-ended whilst using words such as perhaps or I feel, which is a common trick used by alleged psychics to give themselves a bit of a get-out clause if it's discovered that they're talking bollocks, which they always are, unless they're very, very lucky. Even the much-publicised prediction of his own death can hardly be considered particularly impressive. He obviously knew that he was a dying man, reaching the very end of the line, but his prediction of being healed in 4 days would have worked equally well if it suddenly made a miraculous recovery. Yeah, I mean, I think people get a feeling when they're going to die, right? It's like, okay, there, see. I've seen, my grandparents get old and die, and it's like, you just get that vibe. You're just like, oh yeah, they went into hospital, and it's like they went out, and they went into hospital, and they're in hospital a little bit longer this time, and then it's like, people, I think you get the feeling. No? And if the healing was meant to represent his death, then you'd think he would have accurately predicted the date of his death rather than the date of his burial 2 days later. Again, square peg being shoved into that round hole by people who believe this nonsense. Although, I know that those of religious persuasion might argue the toss with me on that one. Wait, religious people think you're dead when you are, buried? What? Still, I'm not necessarily trying to suggest that Edgar Cayce was a devious scammer deploying tricks of the trade. In fact, I don't think that's the case at all, but more on that later. Me neither, Danny. I think he's just delusional. I just can't help but notice that whenever Edgar did attempt to get a bit more specific with his wondrous predictions, he tended to get them all quite miserably wrong. I first became aware of Edgar Cayce while writing the Decoding the Unknown video on the cataclysmic pole shift hypothesis, which is what ultimately led me to writing this script. I don't remember him at all in that video. Maybe he wasn't even in the video. Or maybe I just don't remember things because I make there's a lot of episodes. Edgar had predicted in 1934 that huge axial pole shifts were destined to shake up the globe quite considerably. In its own snoozy words, there will be upheavals in the Arctic and Antarctic that will cause the eruption of volcanoes in the torrid areas and pole shift. The Earth will be broken up in many pieces. The early portion will see a change in the physical aspect of the west coast of America. The greater portion of Japan must go into the sea. The upper portion of Europe will be changed in a twinkling of an eye. Land will appear off the east coast of America. There will be upheavals in the Antarctic that will make for the eruption of volcanoes in the torrid areas. Well, none of that came true. It all sounds a bit worrying to me, but it appears that the logic behind Edgar's pole shift prophecies may have been a little crusty, as he reckons that we would witness the changes between 1958 and 1998. Nope, 2024, and we still haven't seen it. Leading to a major culmination of events by the year 2001. His supporters cling on to theories that we have indeed witnessed pole shifts of a kind in recent years, and you can find more about that in the other video, but it seems fairly clear from the readings that Edgar was suggesting that we should all by now have witnessed the most drastic changes from an epic shifting of the poles, and yet the last time I checked, most of Japan hasn't yet disappeared underwater. No, and America's not staking claim to some new land off the west coast, are they? East Coast? West Coast? Oh my god, it doesn't matter. East Coast, it doesn't matter though. The lost city of Atlantis is another topic which has been covered extensively on this channel by Ilza in the video The Real Atlantis. Spoiler alert, there is no real Atlantis because Atlantis isn't real. It's something Plato made up. So I'm not going to harp on about it too much here, except to say that Edgar made several predictions in this area, including how the city's long-lost Hall of Records would eventually be found between the paws of the Great Sphinx in Egypt, how a massive Atlantis energy weapon described as the Death Ray would be discovered near Bimini in the Bahamas by around 1958, and how parts of the city itself would be discovered around a decade later. Again, not happens. According to Edgar, a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages and seawater near Bimini. Isn't Bimini a type of cocktail? Or is that a Bellini? Wait, that's not a type of... Isn't there a cocktail called something like that? A Bellini's like that little pancake thing, like an hors d'oeuvre. What the cocktail is named? Is it Bimini? Oh my god, it really doesn't. This matters less than that land on the east coast of America. What are you talking about? Just get on with it, Simon. Christ. You have one job. Expected in 68 or 69, so not far away. The funny thing here is that an intriguing discovery was indeed made in 1968 near the islands of North Bimini. Bimini. A team of underwater archaeologists, which is possibly the coolest job in the world, led by Dr. J. Manson Valentine, uncovered an unusual formation about 18 feet below the surface, which was made up of large flat limestone rocks that's now known as Bimini Road, or the Bimini Wall. Why is that so hard to say? Dr. Valentine, great name for a therapist working in a love clinic. Valentine, I guess, who was well aware of Edgar's predictions and became convinced that his team had discovered a man-made formation which could potentially have been the remains of an ancient temple from Atlantis. However, while some people still believe that Bimini Road may have been part of a road or a wall or a pier, most archaeologists and geologists are of the opinion that it's very much a natural rock formation. And just in case you're not up to date with the developments, we still haven't found a death ray in Bimini or a Hall of Records between the paws of the Great Sphinx of Giza. Well, you never know, maybe that death ray's still out there. Any such discovery would be quite unlikely anyway, as Edgar Cayce appeared to be boldly predicting the long-awaited rising of an entirely fictional island made up by Plato. Oh, thank God it was Plato. I was really worried that I got that wrong. In 360 BC to help convey some of his more challenging philosophical theories and serve as a warning against striving for naval power. That's like people in 1,000 years being like, let's go fight Hogwarts. There's a big school for wizards. No. There's not. Over the years, Edgar predicted in his readings that parts of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York would disappear underwater in the 1960s following massive earthquakes, which you may remember didn't happen. Yeah, I don't remember those earthquakes. He also predicted that China would become the cradle of Christianity, and get this, he predicted that Russia will lead the rest of the planet into a new era of peace and hope. Casey, you got that wrong, didn't you? As he put it, quote, "Through Russia comes the hope of the world, not in respect to what is sometimes termed communism or Bolshevism, no, but freedom. Freedom, that each man will live for his fellow man. The principle has been born there. It will take years for it to be crystallized, yet out of Russia comes again the hope of the world." Yeah, look, I'm not some giant communist fan, obviously, or like socialist fan. Less obviously, but also not like crazy about it. But it's like, there's some good shit in there. Like, there's some stuff that, you know, under communism was kind of like not bad. And, like, people maybe looked out for each other a little bit more than in the capitalist system, which is a bit more dog eat dog. And the system I prefer being a dog. But, like, it's not an unreasonable prediction. But it's wrong. Like, in retrospect, it's wrong. Communism didn't work out. Despite later misleading reports to the contrary, he didn't provide a time frame on either of those events, so there's still time for China to turn wholeheartedly to Jesus. And while some people have claimed that Edgar had accurately predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, no, it seems he predicted the evolution of the Soviet Union into a better system of something. I suspect we'll be waiting a little while longer for Russia to save the world. Yes, maybe after Putin's death. Not that, you know, from old age, I'm sure. Please don't kill me. Edgar did, however, give a more precise prediction for the second coming of Christ, albeit he gave himself a pretty generous 40-year window. This perhaps wasn't one of his most lucid readings, as he observed, "For these will begin in those periods in 1958 to 1998, when these will be proclaimed as the periods when his light will be seen again in the clouds. As to just what will be the indications, ye may know it will be as has been promised. As ye have seen him go, so will he return." Amen to that. Dude, what are you saying? What are you even saying? Some Edgar apologists have since suggested that he was speaking metaphorically about the return of Christ-like values. Yes, because there was such a big return to Christ-like values between 1958 and 1998. Yeah, things definitely got more biblical rather than less biblical and more liberal. That definitely happens between 1958 and 1998. You clown. Although they notably didn't start suggesting that until after 1998, when it finally became apparent that it was going to be yet another no-show from Christ. That guy's cancelled more gigs at the last minute than Morrissey. A rather more interesting interpretation is that the prophecy was absolutely correct, and that Jesus was indeed reborn in human form in 1998. It's just that we don't know it yet. Well, he's gonna be going on like 30 years old, 26? 26 years old. You gotta know if you're Jesus by then. Wasn't Jesus like in his 20s? I mean, obviously he was at some point, but like during his Jesusing stuff. I guess that's fair enough. After all, Jesus did apparently go through a wilderness years period in his original incarnation, spanning from ages 12 to 30. Oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I thought it was all happening in his late 20s, but I guess it's in 30s, when nothing was always documented about him in the Bible. I like to think that was his persistent shoplifter period, which was conveniently glossed over in the ancient text. I just imagine him like hippie Jesus, like backpacking around the world, like seeing the sights, smoking weed. That kind of stuff. But I suppose Jesus could just be lying low again as a 26-year-old man and won't make himself known until he hits the age of 30 in about 2028, so stay tuned for that. Very exciting stuff. On the whole, though, I have to say that I'm losing a bit of faith in Edgar Cayce's uncannily accurate predictions. I'll accept that he's had a lucky few strikes and made a good few educated guesses here and there, but they're completely outweighed by the long list of predictions which turned out to be a complete hokum. It was as if he was getting his information from the Akashic record. Someone needs to have a word with the librarian. It also turns out that on the rare occasions he focused his powers on something a little different, say trying to find buried treasure or assisting the police in a kidnapping, he was a bit rubbish. He made a few attempts throughout the 1920s and 30s to use his psychic powers to locate buried treasure, lost artifacts, and hidden gold and silver mines. Presumably, this wasn't about trying to get rich, as it wasn't exactly Edgar's style. It was more about raising funds for his projects, such as the ill-fated hospital. But each and every attempt ended in complete disaster, and he came up with a long chain of excuses for the ongoing failures. The treasure had always been there, but had already been dug up. The treasure hadn't been buried yet, as Edgar was accidentally looking into the future. Pirate ghosts were playing psychic tricks on him for spectral and giggles. Of course they were. Another embarrassing failure was his attempt to help out in the infamous kidnapping plot from 1932 in which Charles Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of Colonel Charles Lindbergh and author of Aviatrix Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was kidnapped and held at ransom. Edgar was never officially asked for help by authorities, but he did provide readings following requests from the public. Unfortunately, whilst the vague and often impenetrable readings did appear to suggest multiple locations where the young hostage may be found, all the information proved to be entirely useless in every regard. Despite the payment of £50,000 in ransom, the infant was only found after it had been murdered. Yes, there were failures, and plenty of them, but perhaps we should turn our attention to the area in which Edgar Cayce liked to spend most of his time when he was asleep, healing the sick. Of the 14,306 readings preserved at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, 9,603 of them are categorized as medical or health readings, and that's not counting the thousands of other medical readings that Edgar is assumed to have performed before they started getting properly preserved in 1923. And it seems that many of them were deemed as successful. I mean, yeah, placebo's a hell of a drug. According to the biography written by Thomas Segru in 1945, there are hundreds of people throughout the United States who will testify at the drop of a hat to the accuracy of his diagnoses and the efficacy of his suggestions for treatment. End quote. It's hard to be sure of the exact number of satisfied customers, but there seemed to be plenty of them, and there was a whole bunch of high-profile cases in which the patients were happy to wax lyrical about the magical healing powers of the soporific physician. Of course, one of those was the 6-year-old Amy Dietrich, and I should stress that there was no sign of misreporting on that case. Several members of Amy's prominent family declared that Edgar Cayce had cured their daughter after 5 proper doctors had deemed her case to be hopeless. It's difficult to assess exactly what happened here, or how Edgar was able to apparently gaze into the child's history and figure out that she'd damaged her spine following a fall from a carriage, which had led to an infection settling on the spine. It's not the only time in history that a claim has been made regarding a non-medical medical healer, succeeding where experienced professionals fail. Of course not, because there's loads of medical cases and weird things are going to happen occasionally. My own gut feeling is that Edgar or one of his team was able to glean information from Ami's family about the carriage fall and made some kind of connection, whereas the doctors hadn't bothered asking about previous incidents. But that is just speculation. It's certainly true that Edgar wasn't short of happy patients who were happy to sing his praises. And I might surprise you here by suggesting that I believe Edgar was a pretty decent bloke who very probably did heal hundreds or even thousands of people. Yeah, I agree. I think he's a delusional but decent man who thinks he's helping, and the people think they have been helped, and therefore placebo works and they get better, especially with the more diseases of the mind. Not everybody left a 5-star feedback rating for Edgar's readings. Joseph Banks Rhine should have been one of his biggest supporters, as the botanist and psychologist was an enthusiastic explorer of extrasensory perception, telepathy, and clairvoyance. But he was reported to have been left feeling disappointed after securing a reading for his own seriously ill daughter and realizing that Edgar's diagnosis had completely missed the mark. Slightly harsh critics have raised the question that if Edgar had such a faith in his own abilities, then why didn't he perform a medical reading for his own son Milton, who died in infancy? It would seem that Edgar and Gertrude preferred to place their trust in medical professionals rather than Edgar's own readings, which makes you wonder why they felt the readings were good enough for everyone except for themselves. I'm not sure it's a fair question, as it was an entirely private family decision taken during Edgar's relatively early years when he still harbored doubts and concerns over his own strange abilities. But I suppose from an outside perspective, it does come across a bit like a kind of British politician who urges you to take advantage of our amazing National Health Service and sending your kids to deeply wonderful state school, while simultaneously choosing private healthcare and private schools for their own family. Yeah, I do kind of think if you're a politician, you should be not allowed. I know it's not going to work, but you should not allowed to have private healthcare or you have to send your kids to state schools. That should be like, if you're an MP, you have to do that. And then you get to choose whether you want to be elected or not. So you can still send your kids to private school. You just don't get to be an MP anymore. Seems fair. However, casting all that aside for a moment, I feel that the biggest problem with the medical readings is that they don't really add up to much in the way of evidence. Edgar supporters will try and suggest that those 9,603 preserved readings are proof of his supernatural abilities, but they don't really tell us much at all. All they reveal is what the stenographer wrote down during each session, much of which is meandering and indecipherable twaddle. Yeah, we don't actually know if this was effective. It's just a record of what happened. We get no sense of the medical history of the patient or whether Edgar's recommendations actually worked for each individual case, and it's not like they were ever performed under test conditions. Whilst it's claimed that Edgar could perform a diagnosis simply by reading a letter written by a patient who was hundreds of miles away, we have no idea what information those letters contained, how much knowledge Edgar may have already gleaned from the patient, or in later years, how much assistance he was getting from the medical experts when performing a reading. And he made a few more embarrassing slip-ups during the types of readings that were diagnosis by mail. On multiple occasions, he apparently tuned into the subconscious of the patient to perform a thorough diagnosis of any niggling health conditions, only for it to later transpire that the patient had actually died before the reading had been made, which I would have thought was a fairly worrying health niggle that should have been picked up. Even so, I still reckon that Edgar Cayce helped an enormous amount of people genuinely feel a lot better and a lot healthier. And he did this via the distinctly non-supernatural medium of offering quite good advice. Oh, okay, I was going to say like placebo effect, but you're right, Danny, because he was saying like, live healthy, do all of these things while not being healthy himself. But yeah, I mean, it's like, go get some exercise. It's just straight good advice, isn't it? Eat less food, straight good advice. I mean, he didn't do that all the time. He was more prone to just prescribing folk remedies, homeopathic and ingredients that didn't actually exist. Some of his more bizarre recommendations for treating an illness included oil of smoke, peach tree poultice, bedbug juice, and fumes of apple brandy from a charred keg. Alright then. Meanwhile, women with breast cancer were advised to place the raw side of a freshly skinned rabbit, still warm with blood, fur side out, on the breast. Oh, dude. No. He also suggested that Latril, what the Laetrile was a cure for cancer and recommended eating 3 brown-skinned raw almonds a day, as these are a good source of Laetrile, otherwise known as vitamin B17. News for you guys, not a cure for cancer. Cancer's still around no matter how much B17 we're eating. I should stress that you didn't miss the memo on this. We've yet to cure cancer by eating 3 raw almonds a day, and while some people out there still promote Laetrile as an alternative cancer treatment, it's only alternative in the sense that it doesn't work and can in fact be highly dangerous on the grounds that it can release cyanide into the body. Yeah, raw almonds, poisonous. Don't eat raw almonds. But when he wasn't spouting rubbish like this, he was actually offering quite sensible advice, some of which was actually way ahead of its time. His more practical and effective tips included taking plenty of exercise, drinking plenty of water, cooking with olive oil, getting a good night's sleep, and eating more fruits and vegetables. And he was amongst the first people in the US to really champion and promote such ideas as making significant dietary changes and recommending castor oil packs, massage, spinal manipulation, hydrotherapy, colonics, and a long list of other genuinely useful remedies which don't include dead rabbits and bed bugs. I'm not saying that he acquired all of this forward-thinking information from the Akashic records, but I'm presuming he absorbed plenty of medical journals, osteopathic works, and various other forms of mainstream, obscure, and alternative literature which stuck around in his head. For a moment there I thought Danny was saying osteopathy was mainstream, and I was like, no, but that's obscure and alternative. Although not so obscure, I suppose. It's just alternative. It's just not got any basis in fact. Of course, prescribing a big dollop of common sense still isn't going to be of much use to a patient with serious health conditions that need specific treatment. But it's no great surprise that patients with a mild illness are probably going to feel a lot better after taking generally good advice. And I feel that this was what was largely happening here. I don't believe that Edgar Cayce possessed any psychic abilities or could see into the future. The lack of evidence, the ambiguity of the readings, and the massive piles of failures would seem to suggest otherwise. I believe he was a well-read man expressing alternative thoughts and ideas and speculations in a deeply unusual manner. Sometimes he made good educated guesses, and sometimes he dispensed useful guidance. But that doesn't make him a psychic. However, if that's the case, that still leaves us with the question, well, what on earth was really going on inside his head? I think he was a good man who was a bit delusional. To be honest, that's what I think. Skeptics have argued that Edgar Cayce was nothing more than a charlatan and a fraud who knowingly deceived his clients and his few thousand followers. I don't think so. If he really wanted to do that, he'd be asking for money. But I'm not entirely convinced that this is the whole story. Aside from a few troubling decisions, such as performing readings for cancer patients who really should have been seeking advice elsewhere, I suspect that he was broadly a top bloke with honourable intentions, albeit a deeply confused and conflicted bloke. Unlike a typical charlatan, he didn't seem to be interested in making money from his superpowers. Considering his level of fame, he could probably have become an incredibly wealthy man by charging for his readings and maybe going on tour and shifting a few books here and there. But instead, he and his family mostly struggled on the financial front throughout their lives, whilst Edgar insisted on doing everything for free, only charging patients or members a modest fee in later life as a way of finally being able to concentrate on his readings full-time without his family starving to death. He never got rich, and he never chased fame or fortune, often appearing hesitant to step into the limelight or take things to the next level. Even in those later years, he would often waive the membership fee if he felt his patients might struggle to pay it. On several occasions, he made his views known that we shouldn't get too bogged down in life by the idea of just grabbing as much money as we can, but instead focus on what will be the best outlet for the greatest contribution we can make towards making the world a better place to live in. And that's exactly what Edgar felt he was doing. This was no mercenary out to fleece the vulnerable at any cost. So who exactly was he? Well, he was certainly a fantasist from a very young age, as we could tell from his imaginary friends, his encounters with winged women, and his bizarre claims that he could read a book simply by sleeping on the front cover, a claim which you would think somebody might have tested under scientific conditions during his lifetime. It could be argued that here was a boy who never grew out of his childhood fantasies. Fanciful tales of fiction also appeared to follow him around in adult life, such as the time that hypnotist Al Lane claimed Edgar had both diagnosed and almost instantly cured his own severe laryngitis whilst under hypnosis, a concept which some of us might find a little bit hard to swallow. So, was this just a case of a man who preferred to live in a world of fairy tales and make-believe? Well, a big part of me would love to think that Edgar never purposefully deceived anyone, and that perhaps he just got a bit too carried away with his own wild imagination. Whether that's true or not is anyone's guess, and maybe I could be accused of being a little too generous in my assessment of a man who must surely have been aware on some level that he wasn't being entirely honest with everyone. Such dishonesty could partly explain why he often seemed reticent to bring his readings to a wider audience and why his buried guilt wouldn't allow him to take money from them. Yeah, that seems like a pretty reasonable assessment. I do have one theory, though. Okay then, Danny, share with us. For starters, I reckon that Edgar had a quite astounding memory. I wouldn't go so far as to say that he had a photographic memory. Well, partly because that's not a real thing, as such an ability has never been proven to truly exist. Thank you, Danny! Same page! At least not as depicted in books and movies, where characters are seen to effortlessly reel off massive chunks of information once they once glimpsed 10 years previously without making a single error. But I do think that he had a remarkable ability to retain information, which may have led to his wacky idea of absorbing the contents of a book by napping on the cover. I believe that he really could recite the contents of a book with reasonable accuracy, although I suspect that he had to open it and read it first. I also think he was a deeply tormented soul. On the one hand, he was an utterly devoted Christian who would read the Bible at least once a year, yet on the other hand, he had an appetite for digesting all kinds of other literature, which didn't always reconcile with his strong religious beliefs. Whilst he grew increasingly fascinated by such material, which dared to deal with science and facts and speculative theory, it was also creating an inner turmoil within the heart and mind of the man himself. It's quite probable that Edgar Cayce had indeed mastered the process of self-hypnosis, so it's not as if he was conning his patients in that regard by pretending to send himself to sleep, but he was perhaps unconsciously using this as an outlet for his alternative ideas and interests which contradicted the teachings of the Bible. As he entered his trance-like state, he began trawling through a stream of consciousness which largely drew upon his excellent memory of interesting information and ideas that he had recently absorbed. In effect, Edgar Cayce evolved into something of a split personality. There was the waking persona of a good practicing Christian who followed the letter of the Bible, and the unconscious persona who could get away with discussing matters of a more philosophical and abstract nature without risking any guilt over questioning the word of God. We could be talking about the two faces of Edgar Cayce here, but only one of them had his eyes fully open. I know this doesn't explain everything, and there are still troubling question marks over how he felt he could tune into the subconsciousness of a patient in order to diagnose their condition and prescribe a remedy. Many of the medical readings gave the impression that Edgar was somehow mentally examining the inner workings of the body piece by piece, and it's disappointingly hard not to conclude that there must have been at least a certain amount of conscious deception at work here. Yet, I would still believe Edgar Cayce had ultimately only ever been driven by a burning desire to help people in any way that he possibly could with what he believed to be a gift, even if this meant occasionally blurring the lines between reality, fiction, and total delusion. Others will naturally take a very different perspective, though. It just so happens that a local psychic in my village also has the ability to tune into the Akashic records, and so I asked her to give a life reading of Edgar Cayce. I'm a bit miffed as she charged me 50 quid for the reading. She obviously didn't follow Edgar's non-business model. But I went ahead and paid for it. We may as well wrap up the video with that reading, though I've whittled down the original 17,000-word monologue to a single paragraph. £50 for 17,000 words? Ain't bad. And on the plus side, she did throw in a few free sachets of graveyard dirt, so it wasn't all bad news. Quote, "We have the body. Now, as we find this entity who got a stick lodged into his testicles," oh yeah, forgot about that, went on to grow into quite a peculiar and gifted man, as it were. It is true to say that he made a few mistakes, just like we all do, you see, but there are further prophecies yet to be fulfilled, which will help to prove how this entity has privileged access to all that will be and all that will never be, and everything in between, as it were. We can't wait to see the look on your cynical faces when, as we find, the entity known as Jesus finally makes his presence known and the long-lost city of gold is discovered in the Gobi Desert and Russia paves the way for a new era of peace and love for all mankind. This is all to come, see? Sleep tight, viewers, and don't have any silly dreams. We are through with this reading. And we're through with this episode. It was a long one. Thank you to Danny for writing it. I hope you enjoyed it. Debunked some nonsense today, didn't we? And thank you for being here.